Okay, good afternoon and welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Valerie White, Executive Director of LISC NYC, New York City, and thank you so much for joining us today for Rising Together, Women Building the Future of Community Development. The Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC, is a national nonprofit that was established in 1980. We are an intermediary that invests capital, financial capital and human capital in underserved, underinvested communities, and we support underrepresented populations. In our work, we stand on a platform of racial and economic equity across everything that we do. And we have 36 offices across the US in major markets and a rural office that covers 40 states. LISC New York City, the flagship local office, supports local partners whose services and programs aim to create a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable New York City. Since April 2020, LISC New York City's investment strategy has been guided by 3 pillars: radical healing, and that counters racial bias and inequity, including through community, safety, creative placemaking, and arts initiatives. Inclusive economic transformation that prioritizes human talent, community health, diverse enterprises, innovation, and public infrastructure, and sustainable wealth generation in communities of color, including ownership, asset building, and career ladders. What an extraordinary year it has been for us all, but especially for women and for BIPOC women. Today, we will hear from a dynamic panel of women leaders in community development field who tackle these hard issues every day as part of their work and as women. We're excited to hear their stories of success in overcoming challenges and how we can prepare women earlier in their careers to take on leadership roles in the future. But first, I am absolutely thrilled that our interim president and CEO, Lisa Glover, is able to join us for this fantastic panel today, and I would like to turn it over to Lisa for opening remarks. Thank you for being with us, Lisa. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Valerie. Can you hear me okay? Excellent, excellent. So, I just want to say to everybody, I'm very honored to be a part of this event and to hear firsthand the stories of these women who have made such a fantastic and deep impact on the community development world. I think it's going to be great for all of us to hear it. Even without hearing the details of their journeys, I can guarantee that there were not only rocks in their paths, but there were probably boulders for them to move along the way. And there's going to be more boulders for us to move. And that's really why we're here today. We're talking and sharing about women, and about women in particular building the future of community development. So to set it up, however, I'm going to go into the past. And I started in community development back in 1995 at a financial institution, developing the bank CRA program and the first fair lending program that we ever had, one of the first in the country. And in that role, I saw discrimination firsthand. EEOC was passed back in the 70s, right? But 20 years later, in 1995, I still had lenders telling me they were denying a loan because a couple was borrowing for a house, was unmarried, and they were living in sin. This is 1995, and this type of thing was still happening. It's still probably happening today. But, my personal experience is what made me who I am today. So in 1998, I'll take you back there, I was a single mother. I was raising 2 little boys, and I didn't have any child support. I didn't have 2 nickels really to rub together. I found out in my job that I had a colleague, a man, who was making more money than I was doing, and he was doing the same job I was doing. And I can't say that I confronted my boss, but I can say that I asked him about it, because back then you really didn't confront your boss about something like that. And straight-faced, he told me that my colleague made more money than me because he had a family to support. And that was the end of the conversation. So I've had a couple boulders of myself to move. As I move forward in my career, I can say in a financial institution, I was almost always the only woman in the room. And I also learned that if I couldn't talk sports, I was marginalized. And at times I was ridiculed for not being able to participate in the conversation. Almost a go back to your knitting, little girl type of operation going on. So I learned to talk sports a little bit out there. I can also say that I was the target of blatant sexual harassment, both within my institution and out in, in the greater community. I'm sure that many of us have experienced that. As I got older and stronger, I dared to report some of this to HR, and I can also say that I was retaliated against for reporting these things. So yeah, I've had a journey. I've moved some boulders, and I have some real wounds to show for it. But I wouldn't trade any of those experiences for the world, and let me tell you why. They made me a stronger person, and they really drove my passion for advocating for women's issues. This has been a passion of mine for a long time. It made me vow that the women that follow me are not going to have to put up with this, including my two very strong daughters-in-law that I support 100%. I do not want anyone to have some of the experiences that I've had. My legacy that I left at the bank was just that. I was an active mentor for women. I continue to mentor many of these women. I was the executive leader for our Women's Affinity Group, and I made a practice of speaking out against some of the things that I experienced. And I intend to continue to do that at my time here at LISC. So, in conclusion, it's events like this really that make a difference for us. It's that personal connection, it's the group discussion, getting these things out on the table and talking about them. All of these things are really critical for us to moving forward on our journey, to moving those boulders and to making the world a better place for women. So again, this is important. I think hearing from the women you're going to hear from today is important, and supporting each other is important. So I appreciate you, Valerie, including me in this. I hope that everybody's going to enjoy the discussion today. And again, thank you for having me on the panel.
So I'd like to turn it over to Eva.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Valerie, for those welcoming remarks. And I can tell already this is going to be a very powerful conversation. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Ibrahima said earlier, I believe he introduced me. My name is Eva Alligood, and I'm the Deputy Director of LISC New York City, leading programs that support our neighborhood-based partners to bring about equity, inclusion, and access to opportunities in their communities. I'm really excited about today's discussion in honor of Women's History Month. In a moment, you're going to hear from 4 leading women in community development. Each of them has an amazing personal story to tell about their path to leadership and their lived experience as women of color who bring that experience to the critical work they do. We've organized this conversation as a fireside chat where the youngest member of LISC New York City's team, Community Development Officer Leah Martins-Krasner, will be posing questions to our panelists on their career paths, their leadership styles, experiences in community development, and advice for the next generation of rising women leaders fighting for greater equity, inclusion, and access to opportunity in communities that have been marginalized for far too long. So lifting up the voices and stories of these remarkable women is timely, not only because we are celebrating Women's History Month, but also because we're at an inflection point in our country where traumatic recent events, COVID-19 pandemic, the economic devastation that has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color, the killing of George Floyd, and the most recent acts of violence and terror on January 6th and in Atlanta and Boulder have called upon us to make change in a more lasting and transformational manner. There is no doubt that here in New York City and across the country, the trailblazers who have the vision, grit, and determination to bring about that transformational change are women leaders like the ones you will hear from today. And we know this because we partner with them and the organizations they run, and we see their immense impact day in, day out. So before I turn things over to our moderator and esteemed panel, I want to briefly introduce you to these amazing women. The first person is Jessica Clemente, who's the president and CEO of Nos Quedamos, a South Bronx-based community development corporation focused on improving health and maintaining community culture. She was born and raised in the Bronx and was inspired to combat asthma and a host of environmental problems after studying environmental science at SUNY Purchase College and returning to her community to serve as a project manager for an NYU School of Medicine study that engaged 4 local community-based organizations to examine the connection between air quality and public health. She was appointed by the Board of Nos Quedamos, one of the 4 groups in the NYU study, to lead the organization in 2011. And in addition to her bachelor's degree from SUNY Purchase, she holds a master's degree in urban planning from NYU. So the next person who's on our panel is Michelle Delaus. She's executive director of Fifth Avenue Committee, a Brooklyn-based community development organization that advances economic and social justice, has real estate assets valued over $120 million, and a housing development pipeline of over 1,900 units. She's been in that leadership role since 2004, and prior to that oversaw social services and supportive housing for 400 low-income tenants with special needs in Washington Heights and Harlem. Prior to that, she was Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez's first director of constituent services and directed her South Brooklyn district office. Michelle holds degrees from Connecticut College and Columbia University and attended Harvard Kennedy School's executive education program. She's also a commissioner on the New York City Planning Commission. And finally, I don't want to leave out that we are very proud that she serves on LISC's National Board of Directors. So our third panelist is Dr. Jocelyn Rainey, who is president and CEO of Getting Out and Staying Out, also known as GOSO, an organization which partners with people impacted by arrest and incarceration to help them on a journey of education, employment, and emotional well-being. Before being appointed as GOSO's leader in January 2020, Dr. Rainey was Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer for the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation, leading their workforce development, administration, security, and human resource strategies for the organization. That was a lot of roles, so I tripped over that word. But she was also previously the Human Resources Director for a specialty food retailer and has held senior positions in the corporate sector. She holds a bachelor's degree from Southern Connecticut State University, a master's degree from Metropolitan College, and a doctorate in leadership from St. John Fisher College. She's also a member of the New York City Workforce Development Board. So finally, our fourth panelist is Jennifer Sun. She's co-executive director of Asian Americans for Equality, also known as AFE, a community development organization which advances racial, social, and economic justice for Asian Americans and other systematically disadvantaged communities in New York City. Jennifer returned to AFE in 2018 after having worked there early in her career managing the Rebuild Chinatown initiative to advocate for post-September 11th public investments in Chinatown's economy and infrastructure. She has deep experience in New York City government, advancing economic development and large-scale infrastructure projects, and her roles have included policy advisor to former Deputy Mayor of Economic Development Daniel Doktorov, Senior Vice President at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, also known as EDC, and Executive Director of Sunset Park at EDC, overseeing development of 6 million square feet of industrial property along the Brooklyn waterfront. Jennifer holds a bachelor's degree from UCLA and a master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University. So as you can see, we are really honored to hear from these outstanding women leaders today. And with that, I really want to just turn things over to Leah Martins-Krasner, our moderator for today, to take it away. Thank you, Leah.
Thanks so much, Eva, and also to Lisa and Valerie. Can everyone hear me okay? Good, great. So thanks to everyone for those warm welcomes, and also thank you again to our panelists. We're very, very fortunate to have you join us. As Eva mentioned, my name is Leah Martins-Krasner, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'll be moderating today's panel. So before we begin, I want to just take a moment to share how we'll be moving forward with today's panel. As Eva described, this panel is discussing the astounding women's leadership that we're seeing today in celebration of Women's History Month. Women and female identifying individuals in community development have made such significant strides over the past few decades with their work more generally, and then also in community development more specifically. So today we just want to take some time to learn how you all have got to the places that you are today and how you lead for a better future. And then also to help us understand and build a roadmap for how we can build a better future for aspiring female identifying individuals in community development and more generally and beyond. So what we'd really like to see is that this is a discussion between you all. I've encouraged you to respond to what your other panelists have shared and to share diverse perspectives on the kinds of questions and themes that we're talking about today. I'll be moving through everything with guided questions, and then I'll be throwing it back to Eva Alligud to be doing a moderated Q&A with questions from the audience, and then I will be ending with sharing some brief takeaways from our discussion. Lastly, I want to share that we do have a chat feature, and I encourage you to use it. You know, it's unfortunate that we can't all be in the same room with a real fireside, although Jessica has a great little photo back there. So I encourage you to stay connected with us by sharing your thoughts, comments, and responses into the chat functions. And of course, share your questions so that Eva can add towards the end. So with that, I'll jump right in because I know we want to get to hearing from all of you. So Eva was nice enough to briefly introduce our panelists, but I'd like to start off by asking all of our panelists to dive a little deeper and share a little bit more about themselves and really tell us your story. What brought you to this moment and what makes you passionate about the work that you're doing right now? And whoever wants to start can dive in.
You know, I don't mind starting. So I think that equity has been my life's work. You know, I am blessed to have a family that has poured into me, and I intellectually know my worth. But I know that throughout my life, there are so many times that I have walked into spaces where I have felt worthless. And those memories go back as far as, you know, the third grade, being the only person of color in a school that my mother, you know, chose for me because of the academic experience that I would get there. So I think that at a very young age, I understood that in our society, that race and gender was something that I would always be battling for my space. And I knew then that I wanted to make opportunities for other people who were also marginalized. And I think that, you know, we need to really think about how do we support marginalized groups as a whole, and not this, you know, segmented thing, like this is this issue today, that issue tomorrow. And, you know, that drew me to wanting to do nonprofit work. So when I graduated from undergraduate school, I moved right into working in a nonprofit environment. Did that for many, many, many years. And then as I grew in that environment, I had an incident where I was there for a really long time, and my executive director, who I idolized, I recall that when everyone was getting raises, my raise, and I was a senior person, wasn't the same as everyone else's. And he asked me, you look unhappy. And I said, yeah, I'm unhappy. And I said, you know, either you don't value me or you don't value human resources, which was my discipline at the time. I was the most senior person in human resources. And I said, it means that I have to make other decisions. And from there, I went into the for-profit sector and did that for many years. But even in that realm of working outside of nonprofit, I was still very focused on how do I create equitable communities within the organizations where I work. So very much pushed into diversity and inclusion, you know, really worked hard at creating policies and practices that would allow for the growth of people who look like me. And I was able to do that in almost every environment that I was in, but it still wasn't the same as working in a nonprofit program where you're working for people. And so after being in the for-profit sector for a really long time, I moved back to the nonprofit sector, was at the Navy Yard for many years, went in as the head of human resources, and found out about the workforce development arm there, and asked the CEO at the time, can I lead that work? It wasn't really being led by a senior person. I said, can I lead that work? I'd love to use what I've learned as a human resources person and be able not to be that gatekeeper, but really use those skills to help people get jobs. So, we worked with the community that surrounded the yard in order to have them connect to the economic development happening there. And I was able to use all of my years of experience as a human resources professional to grow our workforce development arm and really see, really see more outcomes for the people who we served. And, being there for many years and moving into my last role, which was Chief Administrative Officer, I realized that I wanted to run a nonprofit. I wanted to kind of like work towards my vision for this city, for this country, in a nonprofit. And I realized that needed to be something around equity. And how can I bring more equity to communities, in particular of color? I feel very passionate about that. And then GOSO came across my desk. And I said, we are serving young men 16 to 24. Those young men have been formerly incarcerated, but we all know that young people are resilient. They have the capacity to do anything that they want to do if you pour into them, if they have the resources that they need. So, I knew that was my dream job. I have two sons, they're adults now. And I want to see a world where, the color of their skin does not keep them from being able to realize their dreams. And I want to do the same for the young men that we serve. So, not to go on into my path now, but, GOSO is my realization of, I think my lifelong work to help to close the equity gap and the wealth gap and all the gaps that are out there for marginalized groups.
That's a tough act to follow, but I'll try. So first off, thanks to Valerie and Eva and Leah and Ibrahima for the invitation. Really appreciate it and great to be here with such great colleagues. So I'm Michelle Delaus, and I've been the executive director of Fifth Avenue Committee, as Eva said, 17 years. It's hard to believe that it's been 17 years. But I grew up in a working class immigrant family, and I heard in your background, Jocelyn, Connecticut. I grew up, was born in Burlington, Vermont, which is a refugee resettlement community. We moved to New London, Connecticut, which is a working class community on the southeastern shores of Connecticut, where basically a third of the population is Latino, a third is Black, and a third is white. Everybody's working class. And I was raised by my Cuban grandmother. I went to bilingual education as a kid. I remember many a time on at the playground being called names and fighting. I remember my kindergarten teacher putting me in a closet on my knees because I did not speak to her in English. She put crayons on the table and she was like Black and I'm like negro, and she's like Black and I'm like negro, and she's like, in punishment, she put me, in the closet on my knees. And my mom, who's American, was like, didn't I hear about this really interesting new thing called bilingual education? And so I literally overnight went from, being tracked to like a special ed, thinking that I had some kind of mental defect, to becoming the brightest kid in class. And like that experience and others like them throughout my life, made for a strong passion for justice. And I was very much a tomboy growing up. I don't know. I guess we had a little bit of a Napoleon complex. I'm only 5'2", like don't mess with me kind of a thing. That's generally my approach to things. When I was in college, I'm the first person in my family to go to college, first person to graduate from graduate school, had, Had two younger twin brothers who spent a lot of time in and out of prison and jail. And all of those things influence my path. And when I graduated from college, I decided to come to New York City for the New York City Urban Fellows Program. I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but it's basically about 20 to 30 recent college graduates you get to be placed in very high levels of city government. I was placed at HRA in 1990 when Dave Dickens was mayor, when HRA was the largest social service agency in the world. It's the combination of HRA, Department of Homeless Services, and Agency for Children's Services together. And quite honestly, I quickly realized that it was a little too bureaucratic for me, a little too far removed from where the impact was. I went to Columbia for social work and public administration, and I spent my time in social work school telling everybody it's not enough to help people cope. We really need to change the context in which things are happening, and spent all my time at CEPA telling people those spreadsheets you're looking at, those numbers represent people. It's important to remember that. Always kind of remembering this bridge. I went on to work at Center for Urban Community Services, working with women that were homeless and seriously and persistently mentally ill. I also, as Eva said, worked for Congresswoman Eva Velasquez, La Congresista, the first Puerto Rican woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. She was basically the AOC of her day. Her congressional district was formed in the early 90s to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Okay, that's how long it took for that to happen, to create a district that was going to help elect a Latina. So all of these things, I think, influenced my path. I'll just say for Fifth Avenue Committee, the organization's been around for 43 years. I'm only the 5th executive director in 43 years, and 3 have been women. So I think that the organization has a long history of supporting female leadership. And I think that's a strong part of our history as an organization. Pass it on.
That's great. I'll jump in if you don't mind, Jennifer. So let's see, my journey that led me to my current role started in Millbrook Houses in the Mount Haven section of the South Bronx where I was raised. I would not be here if not for my parents' sacrifice and commitment to putting education first, paying for parochial school because they didn't trust the public education system, even though we couldn't afford it. But they did whatever they could to ensure and emphasize that education and experience is something that no one can take from you. And so that's something you need to invest in yourself, and know that as you move forward, that's what's going to drive you. At the age of 22, I graduated with a bachelor's in environmental science. My intention at the time was to save the rainforest and get as far away from the South Bronx as possible, frankly. And until one fateful afternoon, I like to say, with job hunting, I came across a posting of community participatory research study in the South Bronx on asthma. And that immediately piqued my interest. Primarily as someone who grew up suffering from asthma, I was interested in understanding the collaboration between community and academia. This was new to me, and I wanted to learn more about it. More importantly, I think what was really at the center of my interest was that the research challenged a common narrative that was in my community, placing the cause of asthma on how we lived. For instance, secondhand smoke and poor living conditions. There was studies published around roach and pest infestation, and in a lot of ways, it was as if we were the cause. And so my interview was conducted by Nos Quedamos, and that was the first time I met Yolanda Garcia, the founder of Nos Quedamos, and one of the co-founders, Ana Vincenti. This meeting would change my life, the course of my future, completely. Yolanda Garcia shared her personal experience about losing her son to asthma and how this drove her work, both with the research, also in how NQ approached green sustainable housing. She recommended to the partners at NYU School of Medicine to create a position for me to work directly with them on the research side, which didn't exist. I had interviewed for a completely different position. And so as a result of that, I was given the responsibility of working directly with the community groups on identifying sites for the air quality monitors, leading community and educational workshops. In the second phase of the study, we worked with elementary school kids, equipped them with personal air quality monitors on their backpacks, and tracked their asthmatic episodes. This all took a critical look at the high concentrations of waste transfer stations located in our community, the volumes of diesel truck traffic that dissected our communities, creating a toxic triangle. This study was taking research and putting it into the hands of the community, working directly in partnership with academia to collect data and better understand how the environment, the external environment, was harming our quality of life. Meeting Yolanda opened the door for me, and I gained a deeper knowledge of public health research, was able to translate science back into my community, developing recommendations that supported organizing and advocacy within the community. Ultimately, how community-driven planning and development can lead to transformative change. I looked at the leadership and experience in action working directly with Nos Quedamos. This inspired me to pursue a master's in urban planning and environmental planning at NYU Wagner. After the study concluded in 2005, I stayed in the public health sector, moving on to work at the City Department of Health at the World Trade Center Health Registry. Shortly thereafter, I moved on to Albert Einstein College of Medicine to do work on a national Latino health disparity study through 2010. But I always felt like there was something missing. I mean, I worked for the city, which was a secured position. I moved on to research yet again, but didn't quite feel fulfilled. Like there was something just still an underlying feeling that I had, that it wasn't until, I guess, in 2010, almost 11 years now, where I was approached by Gilberto Rivera at a time when Nos Quedamos was in dire straits and on the verge of closure. In its darkest hours, I was asked by one of the co-founders to lead the organization. I was 32 at the time. The decision was not an easy one to make, and I often ask myself, why did they ask me? It was Yolanda Garcia's pride, passion, and tenacity that made Nos Quedamos possible, and it is that spirit that drew me back to Nos Quedamos, where I felt compelled to pick up the baton. I stopped asking myself why and began to say, except that my journey led me here for a reason. Why not me? One day it was like an epiphany, hearing my parents' advice or consejos. Find a job or career that you are inspired by and would do for free, because you will never work a day in your life. And as someone who grew up in this community, who fought alongside Yolanda for environmental justice to do whatever I could to safeguard and rebuild this incredible organization, no matter what the blemish, determined to fulfill its potential against all odds, this is what community succession planning should be: supporting upward mobility from within. Working alongside with other committed strong women like Ellie and Awilda, who helped me keep the doors open at the time to the public and still provide the much needed service to the community, the personal sacrifice and sweat equity that would be required of me, including volunteering for the first 2 years, started to pay off. Yolanda once said, "We stay is not only our name, it is our mission." This is true in more ways than one. It's important to say this mission is not one alone. Our success is the result of unwavering commitment, hard work, and dedication of Nos Quedamos team and board, past and present. Primarily, it is imperative for our community, both old and new, especially for our youth, to understand and appreciate what community resilience, power, and victories look like when you persevere, are bold, audacious, and fearless. At the age of 37, I was blessed to begin a new chapter, my journey into motherhood, and today a proud mother of 2 precocious sons, 6 and 4. And the chapter of executive and mother is one that I embrace and one that I learn to approach every day with kindness to myself and flexibility. And I appreciate being amongst you ladies, game changers, agents of change. And I am inspired by all of you and all of your stories, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share my story.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Sun, co-AD of AFI, and really pleased to be in conversation with all of you today. I'm here because I made choices that really defied what my parents wanted for me. And so for my personal journey, it was very much one of rebelling against a vision that my parents had for me, whereas a daughter of Chinese immigrants who immigrated to the United States, the values that they really emphasized for me were education, but also in terms of my career path, one of stability, because they had had the experience of a lot of displacement and trauma, having been in a situation where their families left China for Taiwan in the context of, the civil war in China. And so for them, what mattered the most was for us to really focus on doing well in school and then going to college, getting a good job. What my father particularly envisioned for me as success was a corporate job, or my mom was about, being a teacher, something that was stable. And my experience, though, was one of being an outsider. Shortly after I was born, my parents were not ready to take care of me. They did not have the financial means to really take care of me well. And so I was actually taken back to Taiwan, where I was raised by my grandparents for a few years. And it's a practice that actually still happens today, where a lot of immigrant families still pay for people to take their children back to Taiwan or Hong Kong to care for them until they can work and save up and then bring their children back. So I think that experience of sort of being outside of my parents and then reintegrated back into the family after my brother was born a little bit later kind of informed my experience of feeling like an outsider within my own family and being a bit of an oddball. Fast forward to when I went to college, my father literally picked my major for me. I wanted to study political science. He chose economics, and so I suffered through economics for 4 years, graduated, and somehow he had envisioned, I think, me being a capitalist, and I ended up being a Marxist when I graduated. So completely exploded his plan there. But a really pivotal moment was I was working in a financial management firm where we were managing the wealth of really high net income individuals working in the Hollywood industry. I was, in Los Angeles. And as I was working in that environment, more and more I was questioning what my purpose was and how I was going to use my education, and ultimately concluded that the people that I was working for at that time, the clients, they didn't need my help. They were doing perfectly well. And I really felt also from the experience of living at that time in a working class immigrant neighborhood, Koreatown, that nightly had the experience of being heavily policed and then commuting every single day between that working class community in Koreatown to Beverly Hills, where I worked. That really sharp juxtaposition of wealth and the lack of wealth in immigrant working class neighborhoods, I think heightened for me that I really needed to play a role in doing something with my education to change that. That was reinforced by my then leaving that job to then work part-time as a youth program manager in Chinatown, Los Angeles. And in that experience, I was really proud to have worked with a group of high school students, Chinese and Southeast Asian immigrant high school students, in advocating for reproductive health access, where we opened the first Planned Parenthood clinic in Chinatown, despite there being a lot of stigma around talking about sexual activity and reproductive health access. That experience also helped me connect to other Asian American community leaders who were leading community-based organizations in Filipino Town, Little Tokyo, Thai Town, these really rich immigrant neighborhoods with community-based organizations that were playing leading roles and working very closely with community residents and really defining their vision for community development and advocating for resources to improve the lives of the people who lived in their neighborhoods. So there was a choice where I could have taken the path of becoming a social worker or being an urban planner. And a lot of the community leaders of these organizations were graduates of an urban planning program at UCLA. And I think that was a pivotal decision for me because I was very conscientious that I wanted to affect change, but I really believe that urban planning was a way of being able to affect change, engaging in multiple levels, engaging at the individual level, community level, city, and at different scales. So that's ultimately how I chose to study urban planning, and that's what brought me to New York City. I was lucky to have the experience after graduating from the Columbia program of joining AFI shortly thereafter and becoming involved in really community-driven planning through the Rebuild Chinatown initiative as a real process for organizing residents, small business owners, workers, community leaders across different sectors within our community to really have a conversation together about what we imagined the future of Chinatown to be like. And it was a very community-driven process. And it was a very powerful experience for me to learn about the power of a community-driven planning process to really influence in how resources are allocated. Because we were in a very difficult position of having to, on one hand, be sensitive to the incredible loss of life at the World Trade Center and the surrounding area. But at the same time, Chinatown was impacted too by being in the security zone of there being limited traffic to Chinatown and therefore really impacting the neighborhood economy and the residents who live there. And so how to effectively advocate for your own community, but in a larger context was a real learning experience. But I did see that we were successful in some ways of advocating for resources to be invested in physical infrastructure and in some capacity building, but also saw the limits of that too, where we were not as effective in, I think, securing resources for more fundamental economic change, which is really harder to do in terms of thinking about how to move our economy from one that was really reliant on garment manufacturing and restaurant and service-based work into a local economy that was more resilient and diverse. But that then created an opportunity for me to work in city government, which was a challenging experience for me, I think, personally, and as I was learning how to find my voice. I felt very deeply imposter syndrome for a period of time working on the policy team in the mayor's office because I was the only person on that team who came from a community advocacy and development background. Until I had a moment where I realized that my difference was probably what gave me power, and that I actually had an obligation and a responsibility then to bring that experience into my work. So rather than leaving it at the door, there was a reason for me to be there, and was actually to use my advocacy experience as a community organizer to advocate then for the neighborhoods that I was responsible for in that office, which was Harlem, the South Bronx. And I was essentially competing for resources with other members of the policy team, to really fight for those neighborhoods. So I learned a lot about, how resources are allocated, about how decisions are made within the context of city government. And from that, really wanted to be a little bit closer to the work. And so that's what led me to work at the EDC and at the Parks Department. But ultimately, I think through those experiences of working in city government, while I learned a lot professionally, I learned a lot about my own strengths professionally in project management, in team building and teamwork and driving teams to accomplish really amazing work. I also realized from that experience that I wanted to focus economic development on work that was more people-centered ultimately. I was more involved in sort of infrastructure building, which is really important, but I felt like I was getting further and further removed from the people who we're ultimately trying to serve. So returning to AFI has been an important opportunity for me to be working in a mission-driven organization, one that is really about community-based and community-led work and really improving the health and equity of our communities, and really trying to join that work with other communities of color as well in solidarity to really work together in the fight for social, racial, and economic justice.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing such powerful stories and really sharing the experiences that have gotten you where you are today. I'd like to take the next question to be a little direct about what it's like to be a woman leader in this particular field. What kinds of assumptions have you run into, and how have you challenged those assumptions or responded to those assumptions to be the best leader you can be?
You're on mute, Jocelyn.
Thank you. I love what Jennifer just said about you know what, not leaving parts of herself at the door, right? And that is something that I talk about all the time. And I realize that as a woman leader, I have to bring my womanhood if I want to bring other women along. Like, folks, I always tell people, I said, I come with my curls and my curves so that when someone else comes with their curls and their curves, you know that they're competent. You know that they can really bring value to the work that they're doing. And I think that, you know, and also, you know, I bring my emotions because my emotions are part of what makes me successful, and my courage as a woman, and, you know, all the barriers and obstacles that have come along my way. And I talk about them out loud. You know, I remember being a very young manager and someone saying something when I was in a meeting, like, oh, I can tell you're really upset, you're really emotional. And, you know, many of my colleagues talked about that, like women colleagues, like, oh, you shouldn't show any emotion. And it you know, and I realized that that is being it's not even emotional, it's passion, right? Like, passion is important. Like, if you're a leader, and I'm sure every leader here would say, if we're not passionate about the work that we're doing, if we're not bringing that passion, then we're not going to be successful. So I just want to say that, you know, it's so important to be your whole authentic self. And, you know I didn't get into specifics about what because there's so many, there's so many, you know, I started this role with someone asking me after, you know, an older, amazing white man had ran this organization and there was never a strategic plan. You know, 2 months into the job, like, are you guys going to have a strategic plan? A funder said that to me, right? So I recognize the expectations for me as a woman of color, is very different than the expectations of of a white man. But that's okay. I embrace that. But I'm also going to make sure that you embrace who I am. And, you know, and that is, you know, that is how I approach, you know, my work and all the things that are thrown at me every single day.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think if there's one thing, it's having to be passionate and being okay with the energy you bring to the work, right? And trusting your instinct, right? Like, we have that woman's intuition. That's that voice that tells you, you know, follow where your heart is taking you, even if you feel like there's challenges with your thinking, right? The imposter syndrome is real. Right. And so there's a lot of this conflict that you have within yourself, even though you feel and know your worth, your value, your confidence, you could still be put in situations where you feel insecure, you know, but still, you know, even with that, just remind yourself that there's a reason why you're there. Right. And you have a value to contribute and share it. Right. And so that's something that I've been coming more and more to embrace. Right. I think coming into an organization at a low point, you kind of go into that where you don't, an organization that's gone through trauma, I should say, right? Having experienced trauma both in the community, at an organization, and then having to be responsible to turn that around, there's just a lot of like heaviness that goes with that can chew at or chip at your own self, you know, confidence. And I just remind myself that, you know what, I'm here for a reason. There's value, right, that I can bring to this. There's a perspective that that no one can take away from me, right? Like, my perspective, my authentic self, my experience, my lived experience is something that no one can take away from me. And so that's something that I share, and I share freely. And I try to be open and listen. Like, I also approach my leadership as a listener, as a learner. Because there's always something to learn, there's always something to pick up and improve, and I really try to share that with the staff that I have, the interns that we work with, the community that I'm present with, and just really embrace that difference. I love that, Jennifer. Yes, and embrace the difference.
I'll just jump in, and especially since the imposter syndrome has come up a couple times. You know, if anyone's familiar with 12-step programs, there's a saying in the rooms, fake it till you make it. right?
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of leaders who aren't the leader that someone expected, there's a bit of faking it till you making it. Till you make it. When I became ED of Fifth Avenue Committee, Brad Lander was the executive director immediately before me, and he was in the position for 10 years, and I was co-chair of the board. And I think, everybody in New York City knows Brad Lander, right? He's an incredible human being. And I remember saying to him 3 months into the job, if I knew then as co-chair of the board what I know now as executive director, I would have offered you a hell of a lot more support and offered you and also asked you a hell of a lot more questions. Right? It can be a very, very lonely role as executive directors, I think, as many of us know. The one thing I'll say though, the question that you asked, Leah, was about like assumptions and stereotypes. This field is extremely diverse, right? Like, community development, you have folks that work in the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, and government. And I think, I would love to see more data about gender and race in the different aspects of it, right? Because I think it could vary wildly. There are obviously lots of women in leadership roles, especially in the nonprofit and government side. Does that carry through in the same way on the for-profit side? And what does that look like and why? And I think that's I think about, for instance, one of the things that Fifth Avenue Committee does is build and manage affordable housing. The building and managing aspect, but in particular the building aspect, tends to be more male dominated.
Yes.
Right. Right. And there's a lot of conflict that happens on construction sites. Right. And I've definitely had directors of housing development and project managers that were women that were basically, they were incredibly skilled in many ways, but one of the key roles they played was as mediators and facilitators of conversation between big egos, of people who like to raise their voice to solve problems rather than like have a deliberate conversation. Obviously anybody you don't have to be a woman to be able to have those skills and have those conversations. And I think, an assumption is though, I think that as a woman, you may have a bit easier time of having those conversations because, someone may not have to save face when having some of those conversations with a woman as if they're having it with another man. Again, that I know that is saying something that is considered to be very stereotypical. But I think that is probably, at least in my experience, the area of the work where the stereotypes are more, more what you would think historically than I think in some of the areas where I think we've made tremendous strides. Yeah, but again, like the field is diverse, and I think to make one statement about like assumptions or stereotypes is challenging because like there's so many different sectors and so many different fields involved in the work.
I think that's a really great point, and I think we've brought up a lot of topics around like imposter syndrome and dealing with all these different styles that are particularly male-dominated, and negotiating all of those different things. So I wonder, how do you describe each of your leadership styles, and how have previous experiences with other types of styles sort of shaped that? And I thought maybe we can start with Jennifer on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. I think a really important sort of experience that I had about becoming aware that I even had maybe the potential to be a leader, because I never really thought about that for myself as a role, because I had emphasized for a lot of my earlier part of the career being really sort of technically proficient and trying to be the most prepared, sort of smartest person in the room from a technical perspective. What I observed around me in terms of leaders was a lot of swagger. There were, white males with a lot of swagger who spoke really loudly, who were very opinionated and who projected a very specific kind of leadership style. But by working closely with somebody at EDC at the time, who had a very different leadership style that was relatively more quiet, but quietly persistent, strategic, I think opened up my eyes to the possibility of there being just a different mode of being a leader. And she was very collaborative and very effective in relationship building. And I realized a lot of her effectiveness was around collaboration, bringing people together, but also this really doggedness. Like if she believed in something, she was very adept at sort of figuring out and navigating within her environment how to build alliances. So in terms of my own leadership style, I think I carry some of that as well. I really emphasize collaboration and inclusion, where I really believe in diverse and fostering even divergent points of view and bringing that together to solve really tough problems. I also personally and professionally feel really passionately about, I think, having a growth mindset or being fearless and risk taking. And I think part of that comes from my own personal experience, where there was a lot of pressure to be perfect and there was really little margin for error within my family that was very punitive. I've been in work environments that have also felt that way. And now that I'm in a leadership position where I can try to change that in terms of our organizational culture, which is something that we have residually at AFI, I feel really strongly about, in my role currently, trying to change the organizational culture with my co-leader to really foster an environment of learning and of, putting your ideas out there, trying new ways of working together as a way of ultimately fostering innovation, but also serving our communities better. And I think that is actually more important than ever as we're emerging from this pandemic. I think that's what it has been demanded of us and how we've had to respond. And so I think just fostering those values are more important than ever. And I try to also model just humility, meaning that, acknowledging when I've made a mistake, acknowledging also when I don't know the answer. I think also what I'm finding with a lot of our staff is they look up to me and our co-leader to always have the answer. And I always kind of, reframe it and ask, how do they draw upon their own experiences and help them remember that they've had a lot of experience in serving the community day to day on the front lines. And so how do they leverage, how do they use that experience to actually solve new problems? And then last thing I'll say, integrity is another value that I really try to bring into my work. I put as much emphasis on how we do our work and how we collaborate with others as much as on the results, because I think sometimes what I've found in arguably sort of white supremacist structures is this overemphasis on results. Results are important and absolutely we need to be focused on impact, but I think we can also be equally sensitive to how we achieve that impact, and that's just as important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Yeah, I definitely think that highlighting those things are incredibly important when we're considering how our leadership styles can best serve certainly the organization and then also the communities that you serve. And so related to those assumptions that white supremacist male-dominated society have put on you, I wonder what kinds of perception of race and ethnicity have had on your career and in your role as a leader in this work that you're doing. Jocelyn,
Unmute,
you're muted there.
And this mute, I'm trying to stay on mute and I shouldn't. So I just want to lean into a little bit of what Jennifer said and say, one thing I would hope that people take away from this is that you need to be able to feel comfortable in what your leadership style is. And I think that integrity is key, and knowing when to say you don't know is really important. And also knowing because we're grown-ups, right? We know where our leadership style can sometimes be a little edgy or difficult for our teams, and being able to own that and talk about that when you're leading, because I for one, the only reason why I would have thought that I couldn't be a leader is because I'm a manager. I like to be on the ground. I'm a toucher, a feeler. I'm on the dance floor way too often. And I used to think that leaders needed to be up high, and that's just not who I am. And I recognized through the last CEO I worked with at the Navy Yard that you can be a really successful leader even if you're a leader that kind of gets on the ground with your staff and you're actually doing the work. And I think to, your question around race is that, I am third generation college educated, which is a rarity for an African-American woman. My children are fourth generation college educated. And, I grew up in a home where we talked a lot about, the talented 10th and, all the opportunities I should have as a college educated woman. And I still struggle through the barriers of being an African-American mother, an African-American woman. And knowing that, yes, my lived experience might be the same as, the exact same as people who are in a lower socioeconomic class. But I will say that, how I'm viewed by society, being followed around the store, watching my son be graded on the color of his skin or his behavior instead of the work that he actually was doing, knowing that every African-American man in my family has been stopped by the police in this country, where, the city where Black people are 8 times more likely to be stopped by the police, regardless of their socioeconomic background. I realize that if you do any kind of nonprofit work, and, I sit on a few boards, cultural boards, and I think that you need to look at this work only through a racial, social, and criminal justice lens. And if you're not looking at this work in one of those ways, then you're not really trying to tackle the issue. And so I think that race plays a role in everything and that I do, but it's also connected to all other kinds of inequities. And we just really have to make sure that we're talking about this and we're saying that it doesn't matter, what your background is, that, race is definitely something that is plaguing this city, this country, and we're seeing it in all the events that have happened during the pandemic.
I would like to dovetail a little bit on that and just about more intentionally creating the space for the diversity, right? Like what Yolanda did for me by recommending for NYU School of Medicine to bring on a Latina researcher was because there were no Latina researchers there, right? So it was an intentional move to open a door that did not exist. And I think making sure that diversity is present on boards, making sure that diversity is present in like who's missing around the table, right? Speaking to your point about being intentional and looking at the lens, always asking yourself who's not here and who needs to be here, who's being impacted, and how can we ensure that the voices of those that are being directly impacted are present, regardless of race or culture or who is being impacted here, and how do we ensure that balance and that equity is present and shifted. So I think that that's really important. How we open the doors in the capacity that we have, how do we ensure that we are long-sighted in positioning and repositioning our community to be able to be present in these places, since we do have a lot of access. And so I think we need to own that too, and appreciate how much we actually have at our hands that we could change lives behind.
I'll just say, growing up, I got a lot of, you're not like the rest of them, or why is it that you don't speak English, or you speak English without an accent. I'm very well aware that, I'm obviously a white Latina, right? I know I can pass, and I know, and I've been in rooms where I was the only person apparently that was had any differences with other folks in the room, and like all of that is, I think, fueled for me this burning desire to make sure to speak up personally, but also to make room for others with the lived experience to be able to speak up and influence the conversation or the public policy or the decision that was going on. Mm-hmm. And those things are obviously alive and well today, but they are different. I mean, I am definitely, obviously this country is very much dealing with its racial reckoning of its 400 years of oppression and its history of discriminating against multiple racial and ethnic groups. And I think that means all of us being comfortable, being uncomfortable in these rooms and in these conversations. And so that's, at least I know personally, I'm comfortable being uncomfortable. And quite honestly, making other people uncomfortable.
Yep.
Like, that's okay.
It's okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'm glad that Michelle's talked about that, because I'll say for me personally, as an Asian American woman and a leader of an Asian American organization that also serves, well, Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in the context of very multiracial communities in New York City. I think what I'm still growing into, I think as my role, a very public role, is one on a personal level, continuing to be more comfortable using my voice. And I think, over time, I have appreciated more and more, and I'm able to do it more effectively, I think, and easily when it's about advocating for others. And I'm helping to lift up the experiences of those we serve, right? So when I remember that it's actually not about me, but I'm just, a person that's helping to make more visible, how people are experiencing poverty, discrimination, that allows me to overcome, I think, whatever personal anxiety I have about playing a very public role for the organization. But also just, being honest that I think, as an Asian American woman, being in spaces where on one hand, having to, and being comfortable with advocating for Asian Americans, but also in the greater context of other communities of color, and recognizing that how our communities have experienced racism and this very long history of racism in this country has been very different from how, Black communities and Latinx communities have experienced racism. So there's shared oppression, but also I think as we think about our work of equity, the solutions for addressing that is going to look different. And so I think there's this perpetual challenge of how I'm advocating not only for my community's needs and resources, but remembering to also advocate for others too. And I think also in conversations with funders, then what role can I play in trying to reframe how they engage with us, right, as leaders, so that they often approach us with, we only have some limited funding and we're going to fund, a specific community or specific types of organizations, and to try to really challenge them, not to fund us from a mode of scarcity or setting us up to compete with each other, but really how do we challenge them to, they have wealth, they have access to incredible resources, and remembering that, calling them out on that, and then working together to fight for greater resources and sharing resources, I would say, amongst ourselves too. And that's a challenge that I make for myself, is not just directing it outwards, but that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, is to what extent can we as a larger organization try to support capacity building for other organizations in our communities?
I wonder, Jennifer, though, is it that the solutions are different, or is it that there are different needs around resources in our communities? I think that sometimes it feels like the actual solutions are different, when in fact there is a lot of work that can be done around policy and advocacy in order to ensure that there's more equity in hiring practices, academia, in childcare, in the DOE, all these agencies and places where there is just inequity for many of our different, many of the marginalized communities across New York City. And I wonder if there's this sense of, I can only invest in this group, this thing right now, instead of thinking about how do we make sure that communities have the resources that they need, whatever those resources are, in order for us to be able to participate in this country's wealth and the economic development across the city in a meaningful way. If we were really looking at what are these policies that are making it so that we don't have the access that we all deserve, right? Like, what are these policies and practices that are happening? And then back to what Michelle said earlier, and I was like talking about like really using data to tell these stories. And, I just want to make sure that we're talking about that, right? Like really understanding like what are the experience of the lived experience of people in our city and across the country through looking at the data and figuring out how to close those gaps through understanding the data.
Yeah,
I think
what I heard from what Jennifer said was, I actually think some of the solutions are universal. The strategies to get there might be different because
That's exactly.
That's the way I think about it personally. But anyway.
Right.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. That's exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that is maybe I think coming off the heels of a conversation yesterday with Nicole Hannah-Jones about reparations, I mean, I think just thinking specifically about closing the racial wealth gap, perhaps, again, it's from that context that I'm thinking that that's a very specific solution, right? That is distinct and important and necessary, I would argue. But yes, I think more generally, it is about different strategies, but again, advocating for policies that fundamentally are not perpetuating racial inequality between communities.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that's
Can
been
I just
said.
add one thing?
Sure.
Can I just add one thing? I would say, like really invest in not throwing good money into reinventing the wheel. I think what happens far too often is resources are put into arriving at new solutions where communities have already developed some sound solutions to problems that we're not getting, to your point, we're not getting enough of the access to the resources to further amplify. But I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And far too often we're there kind of repeating the same process when we already have a lot of, the solutions at the table. So I just wanted to add that piece.
We just need to scale them, right? We just need to scale them.
Right.
So what I'm hearing is we need to have another panel so that we can explore these a little more. So I do want to, give that more time, but I want to make sure that we get to this final question before we move on to the Q&A about, just asking each of you, what are the barriers that you see women facing in community development, and what advice would you give to aspiring female leaders in this role? So I'll let anyone go to that, and then after we'll transition to Q&A.
I mean, I'll do a quick jump in. I mean, I kind of go back to the earlier point I made. Like there are aspects I think of this field that are more male dominated, or more dominated by white folks than folks of color. And I think it's about, like, again, going back to the data, like, and what are interventions that are specific to kind of address those things. I mean, I do think, for instance, that the city and the state's increased emphasis on NWBEs is helping and will continue to help. Like if it's not just a press release, but something that actually gets enforced, yes, that's going to help. I mean, and I certainly think, like, in the last just 2 years, Fifth Avenue Committee, through our hiring of consultants as a nonprofit, has helped 2 women establish themselves as WBEs, right? And I'm very proud of that, and I'm very proud of them, and what that means for the work. I also think, Fifth Avenue Committee and others here are members of ANHD, and ANHD has the ANHD Morgan Stanley Fellowship Program, right? LISC has the Cashin Fellowship. Like, I think these things matter. Like I think, AmeriCorps Vistas, and I think about how many of our staff came up as AmeriCorps Vistas. Like, all of those things matter, and I think are tremendous opportunities to kind of overcome barriers, because sometimes the barrier is just like, do you have any experience in the field that's relevant? And even some limited exposure could be a tremendous foot in the door.
I would even add SYEP matters, right? What got me in the door, my first SYEP job, was voter registration, right? And that in a lot of ways activated the organizer in me, the seeing change. And so I have an entry point at Nos Quedamos where we have SYEP. And I really look to asking them genuinely, what are their interests, right? What are they interested in? And then work from a shared perspective of how can we both benefit, not just how we could put you into, X position to help with Y, but in what's driving you, what's motivating you, what is it about this work that you feel fulfilled by? Because again, this is not easy work, right? Like this is work that you do because you're driven, you're committed, and something that you would want to make sure that you feel inspired by. So I would actually tap into, what's their motivation? How are they really identifying the work to fulfill not just themselves, but an expression of how they represent the community and help affect that change. So I would actually look to SYEP. And I have examples of where I actually hired SYEP staff in positions of leadership, specifically in organizing, to be able to harness the youth lens and perspective of that community succession planning that's so critical, right? Because once I come out and retire, the next generation will come in. And so how are we supporting that upward mobility?
I think that at a really high level, I just want to say that sponsorship matters, right? Like knowing that when someone walks into a room that they're going to speak highly of you. And I think that that's really important. And I think that it's really important to recognize and be familiar with other women who are in our field, in our industry, that are working. And when I leave this room, I'm going to have something positive to say about every single one of you, right? And so I think that sponsorship is really important for young people, and making sponsorship in general for women is important, right? Like we need to lift each other up, because it's so important, because we're all doing really hard work. And I think that we also need to hold funders and other people accountable to what our needs are, and understand that there are ways that we can partner, and as you said, not reinvent the wheel, where if your organization is doing something, it could work, it could really help to solve issues for my population as well, and really like working in that way. And I think that making time for younger women and having moments like this, when we're talking about the trials and tribulations of our career trajectory, but also holding people accountable, right? Because it's our responsibility when young women are working for us, to really tell them like how important it is to sit at the table, how important it is to be excellent, how important it is to be well versed on whatever it is that you're doing, and not allow them to leave not that way. Because even early on, when Lisa was speaking, and she said, I wasn't able to talk about sports, but at some point I was, and that might not be right, but it's true, right? Like it's true. And whenever I talk to young people, I'm like, unfortunately, as people of color, we're not golfing, we're not sailing. And, all my research showed that, hiring managers want to hire people that are like them. So you need to at least be able to talk about those things, so you can change the conversation when you get into the room. So those are just like really high level things that I think are so important, and sponsorship, and lifting each other up, and pulling each other's, coattails when, we're not being excellent as well.
I appreciate that.
What I'll add just very briefly, just within the context of the organization, is once we've been successful in recruiting women, into this field, is also how do we retain them and develop them, right, into leaders. And so, I think focusing on investing in professional development, and specifically around training for managers, because I know that for me, it was really important for me to become aware that a skill set as a frontline worker is very different from managing people. And so just helping people progress in their careers if they want to be leaders, I think it's important to make that kind of investment. And then also obviously investing in workplace policies that support women who are caregivers, right? Whether they're caring for children, parents or grandparents sometimes, and recognizing their caregiving roles. And so paid family leave, and having sort of the additional support so that women can play those different roles while also doing their work. And I think, with telecommuting being much more commonplace now, I think that's potentially a positive trend, and being able to support more flexible types of work.
So I'd like to, well, I mean, we could talk about this for days and hours, but I'd like to transition now to our Q&A, facilitated by Eva Allegood. So take it away, Eva.
Thank you, Leah. I actually want to read off a comment that somebody sent as a response, because this has been so powerful. And this person wrote, "The panelists were awesome. Thank you for making me understand that it is okay to bring your originality to the table, because it is your added value. Advocating for communities is the way, because Jennifer said the wealth is there, so we must call it out. Thank you for advocating for policies that break barriers." So I wanted to share that first.
Thank you.
You are reaching, the audience is appreciating what you've said today. So I don't know if we have time for more than one question, but I'm going to pick this one because I think we haven't talked about this as much. The question is, where do you see opportunities for the principles and practices of community organizing to connect with other disciplines and domains? Is capacity building one such opportunity? I find myself in complex problem spaces where the ideas of community organizing is polarizing, where I've hoped it would be more transdisciplinary and collaborative. So anyone want to take that one on?
That's such a good question, because at the risk of sharing too much, I will say that organizationally, we are grappling with how to integrate community organizing with our other lines of business, because I'll be honest, it does create tensions. On one hand, we do want staff to be able to bring to their work, I think, a critical analysis of power. And we also recognize that there's a very important role for building power as a part of our work, and that being an important strategy for policy change. And so I think that's where it's really important, is really how does community organizing then get connected to social services, like direct service delivery, and to policy advocacy. And rather than seeing organizing in opposition with those things, it's really, I think, having to be intentional and having the honest conversations about how it can be complementary and strengthen those things. And so for community organizers, then I would urge to also then, reach out to other lines of business within the organization. And rather than assuming that you might have to approach it as advocacy or adversarial relationships, be open to the idea that, especially if you're operating within a mission-driven organization, there is a culture that would hopefully embrace you having those conversations of figuring out those tension points, those conflicts, and how to resolve them in really honest ways.
Do you mind repeating the question, Eva? I mean,
Sure.
I think there's some details in there that I want to make sure we touch on. Because
Sure.
Jennifer's response was very, I could say pretty much the same thing, Jennifer.
Well, the person who had the question really wanted to see where there were opportunities for the principles and practices of community organizing to connect to other disciplines and domains, and is capacity building one such opportunity? So capacity building to build up that interconnection.
I mean, what's incredible about community organizing, right, is that it helps people find their voice. It has the critical analysis that was mentioned earlier about power and how are decisions made. I mean, I think when community organizing is its most effective, it provides individual or community agency, right? And it provides consensus about what is it that needs to be changed, right? And I think that problems are very complex. I think where the tension often happens with community organizing is the community organizing sometimes goes to boiling something down to be very simple, or And that's how you organize and how you advocate is different than how you govern, right? And it's different than how you make policy. And you need both. Like the best community organizing is informed by how something actually works, or how difficult, how complex it is to actually implement sustainable solutions to things. I think when community organizing isn't informed by that, it can fall flat.
And I think successful organizing is collaborative, right? Successful organizing engages various stakeholders along the spectrum of who's been impacted by that particular issue. So I think that's really critical. To be able to make the change, you have to be able to be inclusionary and collaborative. And so that's first and foremost, for sure. So I would agree with both Michelle and Jennifer on their statements, and then add that as a component.
So I know we're coming up on the very end of this conversation, which has been so powerful. I just want to say on my behalf that it's exceeded my expectations about everything you've been able to cover. And the one thing I'll say is that I think what's so striking to me is the way that your analysis and the story you tell really toggles between getting things done and the results, but then also being really thoughtful about how to do that and what are the power structures and the leadership pathways and all these things that you've had to confront. Being thoughtful about those things within the roles that you play is so powerful. And that's how you make change, because if we just do things the same way that they've been done, we can't be surprised with the same results. So it's 4 o'clock, but I want to give Leah the chance as the moderator to close things out. I know she wanted to share a couple thoughts. Thank you so much, panelists. You've been just so amazing. I'm in awe. So thank you. And Leah, you close it out for us.
Thanks, Eva. And again, thank you to all of our panelists. I think overall, I would just describe everything that was said today as so powerful and inspiring to hear all your stories and challenges and insights for a better future. Some of the things that stick out to me is as a burgeoning leader, and as I'm thinking about supporting other leaders, is that like all of this work takes investment, and it seems to be both from inside yourself and from others. Like what I hear from panelists is that opportunities to be sponsored and advocated are ways to open doors and to learn and grow, but that also takes work internally. So you have to check in with yourself, this imposter syndrome that we keep coming back to, manage your stress and your hours, and really advocate to hit your own goals. And that seems to be the through line through all of this, that I think we need to push for more leaders. And then the only other thing I'd add is that I hear again that breaking down old habits and old behaviors is just uncomfortable and unpleasant. And like the stories that were shared highlighted that bringing women to the table and being able to actually reap the benefits of bringing women to the table and the right people to the table is hard by design. So it's going to be difficult, but we have to keep pushing for it and deliberately breaking down the old structures that came from white supremacy and male dominance and all of these kinds of things to bring the collective power of everyone to the table. So this has been great, and I hope that many people, everyone that's listening, has left with something to take with them and to continue to advocate for building the field. So this has been wonderful, and I just want to thank everyone again for their time and for their stories. I know everyone at LISC New York City will be looking forward to hearing more about all the great work you're doing, and so we're just very thankful for all the panelists and for everyone who decided to listen in today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And I'm inspired by you, Leah.
Yes, all of you guys. Yes. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Thank you, LISC NYC.
Thank you,
Everybody
everybody.
be safe.